Support for this podcast comes from the law firm of Davis Malm. Whether you're a developer, property owner, manager, or commercial tenant, their real estate attorneys know the lay of the land, not just the law. Learn more at davismalm.com.
WBUR Podcast, Boston.
I'm Daryl C. Murphy, and you're listening to The Common. The National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration reported that 2023 was the hottest year globally. More specifically to us, NOAA also reported that Massachusetts experienced its warmest year since 2012, tying a record. This warmer weather contributes to extreme events such as heavy rainstorms that can lead to flooding and property damage. And a warming planet contributes to much of the weather we experience here in the Boston area. But another factor to keep in mind is El Niño. And that's why we reached out to weather expert Tom Liberto. Tom, thank you so much for coming through to The Common.
Thanks for having me.
So, Tom, I want to start with your blog. You actually have a blog at NOAA that covers El Niño. Tell us about it.
Sure, yeah. We have an ENSO blog. ENSO stands for the El Niño Southern Oscillation, which is El Niño is a part of that. And we have a blog at climate.gov that started in 2014. This is our 10-year anniversary of it. And it's kind of amazing that the blog has been so popular, and just goes to show you that people really, really care about El Niño and La Niña.
Now, the big question here, what is El Niño? How does it begin and how does it affect weather trends? Tell us about it.
Yeah, so El Niño actually happens in the tropical Pacific Ocean along the equator in the central and eastern Pacific Ocean. So El Niño basically means that the surface temperatures at the top of the oceans are warmer than average. What happens is that the water is so warm and the atmosphere is so warm in the tropics that you can create thunderstorms just from warmer than average temperatures. So by moving where that warmer than average water is in the Pacific Ocean, you shift where thunderstorms happen in the Pacific Ocean. You end up moving and shuffling where the jet stream sets up, that area of fast moving winds, 30 to 40,000 feet in the atmosphere in the United States or in the mid-latitudes where we live. And the jet stream kind of serves as a storm highway. So what El Niño is doing is that it's kind of rewriting the roads for storm.
Now, you mentioned La Niña earlier, which I guess is the sibling to El Niño. Can you talk about that?
Sure. El Niño and La Niña, I would say, are different sides of the same coin. So El Niño is when the waters in the Pacific Ocean are warmer than average. And you guessed it, La Niña is the opposite. It's when it's colder than average in that area. So you may not realize this, but in the tropical Pacific Ocean, there is an atmospheric circulation that's going on. What I mean by that is that air typically rises in the western Pacific Ocean. It typically sinks in the eastern Pacific Ocean. And what El Niño does is it moves that all around, while La Niña kind of revs it up to 11 and puts it into overdrive.
Tom, can you tell me how long does El Niño or La Niña last?
So El Niños usually last between 9 to 12 months. La Niñas also tend to last that long, but unlike El Niños, sometimes La Niñas just don't want to leave, and they can be 2 years long. That's why prior to this El Niño, we had what we call the triple dip La Niña. We had La Niña winters 3 years in a row.
Okay, so how do these two weather systems affect us here in Massachusetts?
That's the big question, right? So what ends up happening, and we're currently in an El Niño, what happens during El Niño is that the jet stream gets extended across the southern tier of the United States. And what that means that more storms end up moving across that area. We tend to see more precipitation and rainfall in Southern California and across the Gulf Coast. Mm-hmm. But we also tend to see there be a little bit more precipitation, especially in wintertime, along the East Coast. So we do tend to see there be a little bit more storms kind of riding up the East Coast during El Niño. But on the flip side, those storms aren't now moving where they normally move, which is kind of more to the interior, to the Midwest, to the Great Lakes, and even to interior parts of New England. So coastal areas might see a little bit more precipitation than normal. But when you go inland, let's say into upstate New York or Vermont or New Hampshire or Western Massachusetts, you tend to see below average precipitation because the storms are moving in a different way.
Tell us, how does all of that translate into the winter that we are in right now?
El Nino basically makes conditions more likely on average. In this winter, we haven't had as much snow, but we've had some snow. El Nino is not the only game in town when it comes to affecting how the winter ends up being for any place across the globe, let alone Massachusetts, and the New England, which in general see some influence from El Nino, but it's not the strongest influence in the world.
What is the strongest influence here in New England?
So you have two things that tend to lead to there being different sorts of conditions across New England. One is just what we call the trend. And what that basically means is climate change. It's the warming trend that we're seeing across New England.
Mm-hmm.
And we've seen this in the last several years or so where there's been a bit of a snow drought. But if you take a look at total precipitation, you've actually seen average to slightly above average precipitation. So what that says is that your snow drought isn't because there aren't storms and there's not rain, liquid water falling from the sky. It's basically that temperatures are too warm for all of that precipitation to fall as snow. Other factor that can happen in winter that really affects New England is the polar vortex. As scientists, we call it the Arctic oscillation. You have this big area swirling winds. And occasionally that can break down, meaning it's like someone can open the refrigerator door. And when you open that refrigerator door, all that cold air that's usually locked in place over the poles can spread to the south.
Just to give folks a clear picture, I'm thinking back to last winter where there were several days of extremely cold weather. I mean, this is what we're talking about when we talk about what happens with the polar vortex.
Right.
How much of a factor do you see El Nino or La Niña being in the future?
El Nino and La Niña are always going to put their thumb on the scale. So they're always going to help make certain sorts of weather extremes more likely. It adds on to the impacts of climate change. But climate change is kind of raising the base level of what that is.
Mm-hmm.
So in the Northeast, for instance, climate change is making things warmer. It's making things wetter. So that can lead to there being impacts when it comes to El Nino for coastal areas. And as we move into the future, winters will continue to look different in New England than they have in the past because temperatures are warming. It's going to just be more difficult for snow to occur. And this can have drastic impacts for a lot of places across New England, not only the ski industry, but also when it comes to flooding, because there's a big difference between a foot of snow falling and then melting slowly over the course of several months versus an inch or an inch and a half of rain falling in one day when it comes to flooding.
We're going to take a break, but we'll be right back.
Politics has never been stranger or more online, which is why the politics team at Wired is making a new show, Wired Politics Lab. It's all about how to navigate the endless stream of news and information and what to look out for. Each week on the show, we'll dig into far-right platforms, AI chatbots, influencer campaigns, and so much more. Wired Politics Lab launches Thursday, April 11th. Follow the show wherever you get your podcasts.
And we're back with more from Tom Liberto of NOAA. What's the relationship between El Nino and climate change?
What we can say climate change is doing to El Nino is that it's affecting its impacts. So if El Nino tends to lead to there being more precipitation where you are, a warming world leads to there being more moisture in the atmosphere, which means that you might see more precipitation than you'd expect, even from an El Nino. And then on the flip side, if El Nino leads to there being drier than average conditions, well, a warmer atmosphere also is really good at sucking moisture out of the ground. So that means that El Nino and climate change might lead to there being drier conditions than just El Nino alone.
Mm-hmm.
And then when it comes to temperatures, El Nino, it does the exact thing that I've been kind of talking about here. It intensifies areas that tend to see warmer than average temperatures during El Nino. And on the flip side, El Nino might cause colder than average temperatures in some places, but that impact might be muted a bit because those areas are already warming due to climate change.
I wonder, how should people be thinking about this weather phenomenon? Because these storms can have some very serious effects, right? I'm thinking about flooding, thinking about the property damage, and I'm also thinking about the storms that the state experienced last year. How should folks be thinking about El Nino as it relates to that, like weather preparation and those type of things?
What El Nino does is that it makes conditions more likely for storms to occur. So what I would tell people when an El Nino is forecast or a La Nina is forecast is to look at what normally happens during El Nino and La Nina years, and then maybe take into account the risks that might happen. So if you're in an area that tends to see more precipitation during El Nino and you're worried about flooding, then you can take precautions in those months before the El Nino peaks and has its biggest influences. You can start making sure that this area floods in your backyard. Maybe you take care of that before the season actually happens. So El Nino is, again, the one rare climate phenomena that we can predict with a good amount of skill 9 months before it happens. So it gives you plenty of time to be able to prepare for a potential storm coming in that year or more storms coming that year than you otherwise would get.
Well, Tom, thank you so much for walking us through it. We really, really appreciate it.
Thanks for having me.
That's climate scientist at NOAA, Tom Liberto. And that's our show for today. Thank you so much for listening to The Common. If you want to get in touch with us, hit us up on Instagram at WBURTheCommon or send us an email at thecommon@wbur.org. I'm Daryl C. Murphy, and I will talk to you tomorrow.